Evening all, we're at BMW Edge Federation Square. It's the only venue I've ever been in which looks like it's going to masticate me. It's the most awe-inspiring piece of avant-garde architecture. And as I was walking here along the Yarra this afternoon, I heard a noise behind me and I realised that something had slithered out of the Yarra. And it was in fact a huge crocodile. And it had a clock ticking inside it. And I recognise this crocodile from childhood because it is, of course, the crocodile that J.M. Barrie tells us about in Peter Pan, the one that masticated one of the arms of poor Captain Hook. And Captain Hook had this sort of reptilian variation on the Damoclean sword following him for the rest of his career after the other arm, with the clock going tick, tick, tick. So there's a sort of three images or metaphors for mortality in one. The abbreviated arm, the crocodile, and the clock. So Cook, the croc, and the clock haunted me as a child, and they're here tonight again because we're going to be talking about matters of life and death and how you can create a morality, a sense of ethics, out of what may be to you, by no means to all of us here, a meaningless universe. Lots of things to talk about, and let me just introduce the people who are going to do the talking. Amanda Lohrey is a novelist, of course, and a sometimes political writer, a very good political writer in my view, whose books include the award-winning Camille's Bread, and most recently a collection of stories titled Reading Madame Bovary. Amanda has written about secular rituals, about births, deaths and marriage for The Monthly. This young fellow here is Julian Burnside, AOQC. He's one of the last cluster of QCs, I guess, aren't you? What are you now? An SJ or something?
No, but new ones are SC. It's just I'm the old currency still.
Yes, you're old money.
I get to hang on to it.
You're pre-decimal, right, yes. Okay. Now, Julian is a barrister in the field of commercial law. He became a hero of mine because of his bold roles on behalf of refugees, asylum seekers, his great and memorable attack on certain shock jocks who remain nameless like Alan Jones, and in what little spare time he has, he's also an author of books for kids and grown-ups. Tony Coady is our token godbotherer. He's a former journalist and philosopher, the founder and director of the Centre for Philosophy and Public Issues at the University of Melbourne. Tony's written widely, and I would say wildly, about politics, ethics, morality, and the philosophical connections between those topics. And he was telling me in the green room he's recently had a mild altercation with Richard Dawkins, and I have some sympathy for that because although Richard is a fellow atheist, he's an incredibly abrasive and humorless fellow. Welcome all of you, and let me also extend the welcome to the Gladdies and the Poddies who listen to the Little Wilders program. Okay, I'm going to ask each of you this. Tony, do you fear the crocodile? Do you fear death?
Well, I think everybody fears death, or pretty near everybody. I think it's a very deep psychological instinct in the human species. The philosopher Thomas Hobbes built pretty much a whole ethic and political philosophy around the fear of death.
I don't want to hear about Hobbes, I want to hear about you at this stage.
Well, I'm just associating myself with good company, I hope, you know. So the idea of dying, the idea of ending it all, is something mostly people approach with apprehension. Not everybody, of course, because certain things can happen to you that make death preferable to going on. But mostly we want to survive. I once heard a philosophy talk by a young man when I was in South Africa on the Stoic attitudes to death, which tend to say that we shouldn't worry about death. And he began his talk by saying, I like it here. And I think there's a lot in that, you know. I mean, I think that it is actually something to fear in a way, the departure. But I do find that as I get older, I fear death less and I fear dying more. When I was young,
in other words, you're concerned about the mode of death, that
yes,
it might be
yes.
painful or...
Well, not only painful, but deeply undignified and drawn out and so on. When you're young, I think you're mainly thinking about accidents, you know. I don't want to fall in front of a car and so on. But when you get older and you've seen more people die, I think that's the process that starts to dominate.
I became obsessed with death at the age of 4 and 5 when I discovered it, and that bloody crocodile's been keeping pace with me ever since. Amanda, do you fear death, and if so, why?
Yes.
Or why do you mainly fear it?
I fear death, but like Tony, not as much now as I did when I was young. I think when you're young you have a sense of entitlement and you're haunted by the idea that you might die young and miss out. You won't have your fair allotment and this won't be just and reasonable. You won't get your fair share. And then once you get to a certain age and you think, well, yes, I've had a reasonably good life, or at least I've had a reasonable allotment of time. So then you start to think about death in a different way, I think. And as Tony said, you start to think about how to die and where you're going afterwards, if anywhere, and what kind of funeral you want and who you don't want to have there, and in particular what music you most definitely don't want played. And you start to leave a long...
I would have thought you want to have I Did It My Way sung by Frank Sinatra.
I think that's one she doesn't want, isn't it?
No. I think like Gough Whitlam, you start writing long and complicated wills that, control freakery across every detail.
I told you that off stage.
I've read about that.
You're naughty.
But
okay.
I've done it as well.
Julian Burnside, AOQC, how do you feel about RIP?
It doesn't worry me in the slightest. I don't fear death at all. I'm a little bit with Woody Allen that I don't want to be there when it happens because the manner of dying does worry me. I don't want to die slowly and painfully. I do not want to die in a way that is undignified or horrible. But the idea of being dead doesn't trouble me in the least.
Have you always had this equanimity about mortality?
I think so.
Makes you a very rare character.
Ooh, that's telling me that I'm here. It's handy.
Let's console him.
Oh, he's calling.
I just don't see the problem. The idea of ceasing to exist doesn't worry me at all.
Okay.
I wouldn't mind if I had some assurance in advance that I'd get reasonable reviews. I'm reminded, Clarence Darrow, the great American trial lawyer, once said, "I've never killed a man, but I've read a number of obituaries with great pleasure." And I'm not sure that I'd want my obituary to inspire pleasure in people.
I now would like to ask you this. I never had a scintilla of religious belief, although I really would have liked it when I was 5 years old. It would have been something of a comfort. But Tony, what's your spiritual journey? Have you always been had a religious conviction?
Yes, I'm a Catholic of
really
of the kind that probably wouldn't be acknowledged by the Pope. I fall into that category they often refer to as liberal Catholic. So I'm a bit hard to predict on what I believe and don't believe. I can go into the detail of that if you like, but this conference in Oxford where I met Richard Dawkins, after I gave my talk, someone got up and said, "Oh, you're a cherry-picking Catholic." Another fellow said, "Yes, you're a supermarket Catholic." And I said, "Well, I don't know about you." He was a rather large man that asked this question about the supermarket. I said, "I don't know about you, but if I go into a supermarket, I'm very careful about what I buy and eat. You perhaps go in and eat the lot, but that doesn't seem to me very rational." So I think this cherry-picking thing is a bit of a red herring. I think it's just an issue of rationality.
You've raised the Catholicism issue now for hundreds and hundreds of years. Catholics lived in dread of death because they might have been sent down to this terrible place.
Yeah.
And, with the rest of the Liberal voters, and I wondered...
Yes, I think they're there, yes.
But to me, Catholicism, for most of its existence, didn't actually soothe people about mortality because it confronted them with the Last Judgment.
Yes, I think people who think of an afterlife, and it's relevant, of course, to the question of death, often think that it's an easy, consoling idea. But, of course, in the history of Christianity, it's been connected with the idea of judgment. So the options are not always particularly attractive, as you say. I myself don't actually believe in that sort of hell, but certainly quite a lot of people do or did.
Amanda, has religion filtered your thoughts about death at any stage in your life?
Only in childhood, when I had a religious upbringing, but that was a very long time ago.
What brand of religion, might I ask?
Catholic.
Good on you.
It's a very useful upbringing because it inculcates a habit of self-reflection, also scepticism, eventually. I'm a positive agnostic. I think we're all profoundly connected in a vast plane of unified consciousness. I think when we die, our energetic selves, something happens to that energy. Energy has to go somewhere. We're not machines. Where it goes and what happens to it, I don't know. I'm interested in all the theories about that the Buddhists and Vedantists have. But basically, being an old-fashioned empiricist, if I can't see it, hear it, feel it, or touch it, I'm not prepared to pontificate on it. Nevertheless, I have had personal experience of a profound interconnectedness, which you could call, in a post-secular sense, secular spirituality. And that seems a contradiction in terms, but in fact it's a new and emerging field of exploration where people are neither dogmatically religious nor dogmatically atheistical and open, just simply open to possibility.
Okay, Julian, what about you? Were you born into a family of godbrothers, or did you?
No. I was born into a non-religious family, but I went to an Anglican school which took religion fairly seriously, and I took religion pretty seriously. I deferred being confirmed for 1 year, so I was unfashionably late in being confirmed because I thought I had to understand what I was doing. And I then used to go to communion every Sunday until about the end of matriculation, when I began to think, this is all bullshit. This is how do they expect us to believe this stuff? I really couldn't understand at that point how we had been conned into believing things that were demonstrably unsupportable. So religion and I parted company. But as someone once said, Anglicanism is good because you don't actually ever lose it. You just forget where you put it. And I think that's an advantage Anglicans have on the Catholics. But now I'm a sort of resolute
I remember
agnostic.
one night on the program, I had 3 extraordinary women, all prominent in their nation's politics. One from the US, an African-American woman who'd opposed the war on terror, almost alone in so doing, Carmen Lawrence, and I'm ashamed to say, an English politician whose name escapes me, but she was a dissident during the Tony Blair years. And each of them had a similar attitude to social justice. And I asked one of those questions you shouldn't ask because I didn't know the answer. And that was, I was trying to work out a connection between them. And all 3 were lapsed Catholics. And I've decided that lapsed Catholics, rather than RCs, LCs, are one of the most powerful groups on the planet. Because they bring with them, if you like, the morality or the notional morality of true Catholicism. But they dispense with some of the harsher dogma.
Yeah, I think it's regrettable that religion has had such good press because religious dogma especially seems to have had a more malignant effect on the world than just about any other force you can identify, whereas a framework of moral beliefs is fundamentally important. And religion does not have a stranglehold on it.
Well, that's what we're here to discuss, how we hammer out a belief system, a value system for life if we don't necessarily believe in a meaningful universe. And to me it never has had meaning, but you try to scribble some subjective meaning onto your little blackboard against the great blackness of time and space. Do you acknowledge, Tony, that it's possible to create an ethic without any religious impulse?
Oh, absolutely. I'm always rather amazed at people who think it's not possible. I mean, some of the greatest philosophical figures in the history of thinking about morality had no religious input into it. Aristotle, notably, Confucius, another. Insofar as there are vaguely religious things in the background, they don't figure in the accounts they give of what it is to lead a good life. And indeed, in Aristotle's case, the account he gives is one that's taken up by Christianity in the Middle Ages and later. So it's undoubtedly possible. I don't think I'm amazed that people even say it's not. But I do find quite a few atheist friends who are very anxious to say you can have an ethic without religion. So people must have been bashing them over the head, saying you can't.
Tony, it happens all the time. I get half a dozen letters or emails a week saying that I cannot possibly have a moral basis to my life or any other atheist because I lack this divine spark.
Well, apart from anything else, the Catholic theological tradition has always held via this rather strange idea of natural law, but I think it can be given a sensible account, that you can work out all sorts of important things about morality by natural reason alone. There are some things that might require some belief in God. I mean, whether you've got an obligation to worship obviously requires belief in God. And there may be some other ways in which religion impinges on morality, but the idea that it is wholly dependent on religion seems to me just false.
You, Amanda, describe a feeling which I would characterise as a sense of the numinous, and that's a word I've nicked shamelessly from theological vocabulary, because it's something which unites, I think, everyone. If they've got any soul at all, any brain, to walk out at night, look up at the sky and sense the eternal and the infinite and the astonishment of it all. But when you are feeling your current strength of conviction, or at least a strong possibility of this unity, does it come from Catholicism to any extent, or did you wipe that and start again?
No, it's a purely subjective experience. Everybody owns up to the numinous, even Richard Dawkins, certainly Christopher Hitchens. Most atheists own up to the numinous. They just define it in non-traditional or orthodox religious terms. The point about the experience of a meaningful universe is that it is largely mystical, it is largely subjective. It's difficult to explain, and you can't impose it on other people, and you can't evangelise for it or against it. And if someone has it, you can't argue against it. You can't tell them that their experience is wrong or inaccurate. And so for that reason, you should always be working off a basic position of respect for the other person's experience. I think that's absolutely primary. One of the things I don't like about the so-called new atheists is their contempt and their sneering and often shallow dismissiveness of other people's experience. It's not a good basis for a negotiated consensus in the social and community sphere.
Someone should tell the missionaries that, shouldn't they?
They should, absolutely, and they're absolutely as much to blame, and they occupy the same position, and as many people as have observed, the new atheists are the mirror image of fundamentalist religionists.
Julian, you belong to a profession which is greatly reviled, as you know. In fact, when I was collecting jokes for the Penguin Book of Australian jokes, 90% of them seem to be bashing lawyers. But you have redeemed the entire profession in recent years.
I'm sure they'll be grateful for that.
Well, you know, I'm just being awfully nice to you here, but the fact is you are driven by morality. I can't think of anyone in your profession quite as driven to live a moral life as you are.
Oh, I think that's over-pitching it, to be honest. It's true that ethical thinking has shaped a lot of the stuff that I've done publicly, but I don't regard myself as any more or less moral than anyone else in the profession or in the community at large, and I really hope no one imagines that I
Would you swear that on the Bible?
Well, that'd be meaningless, wouldn't it? I would solemnly and sincerely declare and affirm that I'm no better or worse than anyone else when it comes to morality generally, but, you know, I try to do things that my morality tells me I have to do.
I was just going to pick up on something Amanda said, because I think we need a couple of distinctions here, the typical philosophers move. When she said that morality was subjective, I'd want to...
No, I didn't say morality was subjective.
Well,
I said the experience of a meaningful universe is subjective, which is a very different thing.
Right, and that's the difference I wanted to point to, because you introduced it by talking about meaning. There's part of morality which is, and partly what I was talking about, is about various obligations and duties and permissions and so on. And there I think it's capable of being perfectly objective. I think it's possible to defend some of the positions that Julian, for instance, takes into his public life by argument and reason and appeal to experience and understanding and to some degree emotions.
I'm immensely relieved to hear that, Tony.
Well, I only said some of the positions.
I know.
But that's one area of morality. But then there's another kind of area that's more connected with the spirituality and so on and things of that kind. And that's often to do with certain sorts of ideals or aspirations or choices of style of life which can't be said, you know, I'm doing it this way, so everybody else must do it the same way. That can be a very important area as well. It's open to reason as well, but not as securely as some of these other things.
I have to identify what's going on. Under the auspices of the Wheeler Centre, we're at Federation Square in Melbourne, and this is doubling as a late night live, and my guest in discussing the morality of mortality are Amanda Lohrey, Julian Burnside and Tony Coady. A question I want each of you to think about. How, at the end of a life, does one judge a life? The crocodile has come along and it's taken its final bite, and you're lying there and you're looking back on your own life. How would you, Tony, judge your life? How would you judge it by its high points, by its mean average, by...
Yes. Very hard question. I think one of the crucial things that one would want to look back on was just how much love there'd been in your life and how much you'd been an agent of love and of restoring and helping relationships amongst people, and how much you've actually contributed as well to the public good in some small way. You know, of course, you'll also look back at all the horrible misjudgments and mistakes and active acts of vice that you've fallen into, but with a bit of luck, there'll be more of the other that you can look back on, and that's, I think, one of the things you should be aiming to achieve.
And that's how you judge the life of another, I suspect, is it not? Pretty much the same sort of process.
Yeah.
Love would be important.
Yeah, I think that's one thing I do take from Christianity. I mean, that it's not something that would just come naturally out of Aristotelian reasoning, for instance. I do think it is actually a contribution that the scriptures have made.
Amanda, another society that had something to do with crocodiles was the ancient Egyptians, and they had no real written law, but they had the concept of Ma'at, where on death your heart is weighed against a feather, and that decides the afterlife. Is that the way you would feel when you were judging your life, weigh your heart against a feather? In other words, would you pick up too on what Tony says about love?
Well, first of all, I wouldn't judge anyone else, not because I have a moral position on that, but because I can't know what they've really done in their lives. Ever since Sarah Dowse told me the story about how Malcolm Fraser secretly saved the women's shelter in Queensland against Bjelke Peterson's predations, I've realised that you should be very careful what you say about anyone, unless you're under the bed or living in their pocket. That's the first thing. I wouldn't bother judging myself. I think that's a Christian notion of repentance, and it's about looking back. And dying should be about being fully in the present and making, it sounds absurd, making the most of that experience, because you haven't got any other choice. You might as well. And it's a waste of time to look back, unless you have a Christian notion of repentance for the past.
Your turn, Julian.
Yeah, like Amanda, I wouldn't try and judge anyone else's life, and I'm not much interested in the idea of suddenly stopping at the brink of the abyss and assessing my own life. But I do think, seriously, first of all, I start with the proposition life has no particular purpose. I do not see it as being part of any grand plan. And so, you know, doing the best you can is a pretty important guiding principle. And I quite like the idea that what you do for yourself in your life dies with you. What you've done for other people lives after you. And if there's any sense at all in which I believe in the notion of immortality, and broadly I reject the idea of immortality, but in the limited way in which I believe in it, it's this, that if what you do in your life lives on in the memory of other people, then to that extent you live on. You can do it by bringing up your children wonderfully into being marvellous people. I think that's one of life's great achievements. You can do it by contributing to the general good in one way or another. It really doesn't matter which path you choose, but the real question is, have you done something which benefits other people rather than benefiting yourself? And if so, well then perhaps for a generation the sense of what you were might live on. And if that matters after you're dead, well, terrific.
Tony, your response to what we've just heard?
Oh, I don't have a lot of disagreement with that. I do think, well, the way you framed the question was, how do you consider your life and think back on it? I don't think that's an unnatural thing to do. I mean, it is a good thing to live in the present in all sorts of circumstances. But I wasn't thinking of repentance particularly, though you might have some things to repent. I was thinking more of just what sense you had of how your life had gone, and I think some of the things that Amanda and Julian have said would be consistent with what I said. As for immortality, I think it's very deep in the Christian tradition that there is some form of survival of death, some form of afterlife. But I think most of the images and pictures that go with it are just ridiculous. And I think that St. Thomas and the classic theologians do say that our language is amazingly inadequate for describing anything to do with God and with godly things. And religious people frequently forget this, I think, and come out with very confident assertions about all these things that are very hard to justify. So I think it's something of a mystery what survival would be.
Amanda, do you have some hint of an afterlife? One of the last things that Manning Clark ever said to me was that I have a shy hope.
Yes.
That's a very lovely phrase, I think. Yes. No, as I said before, I don't know. I don't know. That's the simple...
Do you have a shy hope?
I have a curiosity. There's no point in hope. I'm curious. But I don't know. I really don't know. And I don't think it's important to know.
Someone once asked Graham Greene, when he was very old, precisely this question about the afterlife. Did he still believe in an afterlife? And he said, look, the issue has lost interest for me. I used to have a lot of interest in it. Now, he says, soon I'll know one way or the other, or I won't know at all.
Yes, exactly.
Well, Julian and I are in the you won't know at all category. This is it.
You may be surprised, Philip. You may be surprised.
I'll be furious.
It just means you won't recognise us.
I'll try to.
Or maybe you won't be allowed to speak to us.
One of the things that makes it different for a group of Australians of our eras to discuss this is that most Australians of our era, have been denied a lot of direct access to death. The last century, 150 million died in wars and genocides, and all over the world, people saw a lot of bodies. I keep meeting people in their 50s who have never seen a corpse. They look at them voyeuristically, or people holding their breath on television, which is pretty much a culture of death in so many ways, but they don't, in fact, know directly of death, because it's now secret. It's now something that's dealt with euphemistically behind screens in hospitals, rather than the grand tradition of sitting around the deathbed, or, as Bruce Petty points out to me when he spent a couple of years in Southeast Asia, where everything is public. You hear mum and dad making love at night, you see her belly grow big, you see grandma die, you see her dead. All of that is there on show. It's not on show so much for us, is it, Joe?
Sex and bodily functions are the taboos that have gone. Death is the remaining taboo. It's now probably the most taboo subject available. People hate the idea, and you're right, we don't see dead bodies. In the past, in previous centuries, people would see their grandparents and their parents die in the house, and they would see their bodies laid out. And of course, in Muslim societies now, they have a ritual washing of the body, so they're all accustomed to the idea of a corpse. For us, it's horrifying.
And in India, they burn the bodies in public, so that...
I want to conduct a poll here, because we may be wrong. In the audience here, would you raise your hand if you've seen a dead relative? See, we're wrong. On the basis of this poll, overwhelmingly wrong.
Well, you will draw 19th century audiences.
It may be a bad sample.
To the ladies and bodies, that is entirely erroneous. Everyone here is young and fresh. But does this affect one's philosophies about mortality, if in fact access is denied or death is dealt with euphemistically, Tony?
No, I mean, I'm shocked by the poll you've just conducted, so I'm a bit nervous about making any predictions.
Well, I'm not going to end the program because this is we got it wrong.
I think it's true that there's a certain kind of reticence about discussing death. I think we don't seem to be showing much, but I think in ordinary life it's certainly not greatly talked about. And I know that from personal experience in some cases, that when people are dying, there's an enormous reluctance to speak to them about the fact that death is imminent. When my father died, that was in Sydney, and I said to him, when it was clear he would be dead in a few days' time, I said, well, this will be the last time I'll see you, and I kissed him goodbye. And my mother was horrified at my having brought that topic to bear on the thing, and she was really put out. And I think it's probably the case that people just do keep very quiet about that in those sorts of situations.
It's interesting, isn't it? Because the person who is very close to death and knows it probably wants to talk about it.
Yes,
you know?
I think that's right. Yeah, I think Dad was pleased I said it. But,
yeah.
But I think there is this very strong reserve associated with that. At least from my experience, it might be quite different with other people.
Amanda?
Well, I was thinking death has become so medicalised that with the retreat of religion, particularly in a country like Australia, there are now no standard or traditional rituals around dying. Only the tubes in the hospital or the hospice maybe. But there's a movement afoot, as they say. Australians are very innovative about civil and secular ritual, and there is a movement afoot to think about this and to devise secular rituals about dying, both before and after, that suit the individual. And hospices are becoming, in particular, very receptive to all kinds of innovations, where dying people can pretty much request whatever they like, and the family can conduct whatever rituals they like. So that one relative of mine, in fact, asked that her coffin be brought into her room while she was dying, and that the family decorate it in front of her, particularly the children. And that became a kind of ongoing party that went on for days. And
a sort of pre-death wake.
A pre-death wake. And she enjoyed it, they enjoyed it, and it became a kind of ceremony.
I want to come back to ceremonies in the 21st century, but a thought suddenly occurs to me. You talk about the medicalising of death. We also use the massive technologies of medicine to avoid it as long as possible. I've had a lifelong interest in the mummification processes of ancient Egypt. But where I have coffee in Sydney, I'm surrounded by women who have mummified themselves while alive. It's quite extraordinary, the number of women in Double Bay who walk up and down showing clear signs of mummification. And it doesn't come cheap. Julian, ritual. Are we learning to create... No, first of all, should there be secular rituals for this rite of passage to help the bereaved as well as the ex-human? Or, and if so, are we starting to learn what they might be?
Well, I think rites of passage are very important. Whether you have secular or religious rituals, you need rituals of some sort. You need to mark the occasion. And there are plenty of non-religious occasions that people mark. I mean, the 21st birthday used to be one of the major rites of passage. It had no religious connotations whatever. I think now it's the 18th birthday because you get a licence, but again, no religious overtones, but people want to mark the occasion. I see nothing wrong with the idea of celebrating, noting, commemorating things like birth, death and marriage, which are at least two of the certainties of life. Seems a really good idea.
Tony?
Oh, I mean, just a stray thought occurred to me in this connection of recently in this city, the Catholic Archbishop Dennis Hart, whom I won't name, issued a promulgation that commemorating the life of the dead person at a Catholic church service was to be ruled out. You know, that people were there to pray for the soul of the deceased and so on, and he was outraged apparently by the fact that people like to make speeches about what the person's life had amounted to, going back to your earlier question, and play some music that was significant for the dead person and so on. And I thought that showed an outrageous misunderstanding of how the church should deal with these sorts
Which
of
is
matters.
odd from the Catholic Church, because they're usually right up there with the zeitgeist, aren't they?
You must give me some examples, Sir Philip.
Amanda, rituals.
I think
You've described an extraordinary one, which I've never heard in my life.
it's a good one, isn't it?
Decorate the coffin.
I think one of the things we've lost with the development of secularism is a sense of ceremonial time. You know, time is just constantly flowing. You know, we don't even have Sunday as a special day. I'm all in favour of Sunday, no shopping on Sunday, simply as a way of marking a pause in the working week. Should have nothing to do with religion in my mind. So we have no ceremonial time, we have no sense of actually going into a zone where we reflect and we rest. And ritual is all about getting together and going into some other space, some other zone that has some other kind of meaning and fullness other than just industrial time. Industrial time is just work, 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 and it's also future time. It's always oriented towards goals and bottom lines and planning, and you know, the entire stock market is geared around future time and futures trading, and it's hectic and it's accelerated. So I think we need to rethink the whole idea of slowing down and forms of ceremonial time, and that has nothing to do with religion.
You know, we are in fact witnesses to a ceremony on an absolutely regular basis, tragically regular, and that involves an unpopular war in Iraq. And what we do now is every death has to be dealt with culturally and militarily and politically. We're not encouraged to have contrary views on the war, but we come together to celebrate the soldiers who die in it. Now, OK, it comes out of an Anzac tradition as well, but its function these days is, I think, quite politically brutal. Would you agree, Julian?
I agree completely. Whatever ritual you have associated with a person's death, I think, is essentially private, in the sense that it's for the family and those who are close to them and those who will actually miss them. The idea of having the politicians turning up for photo opportunities at the death of a soldier is noble in one sense, but as it is repeated, it begins to look cynical. And I think that's... I mean, I've experienced the death of my brother when he was 20. If he had died in combat, and the politicians had muscled in and tried to take the limelight in the funeral service, I would have been outraged. It's an appalling, a terrible, frightful, unspeakable thing to lose someone who is younger than you and related, and to have the commemoration of such an event hijacked by politicians or hijacked by anyone for reasons unconnected with that person's life, I think is disgraceful.
And yet we had a huge secular ceremony in this country which was conducted by a politician, which I found one of the most moving experiences of my life, and I submit our collective life, and that was when Kevin Rudd, whatever happened to him, said sorry. Now,
but that was not marking a death. I think Sorry Day was fantastic. I agree with you completely, but that was not marking the death of an individual. It's a different ceremony.
It was marking, to some extent, the death of a culture or the attempt to kill one off.
OK, but I think the metaphor doesn't stretch that far. I don't think it's a problem.
No, but I'm talking about secular ceremonies.
I understand that, and secular ceremonies can be, terrific. But it's the nature of the ceremony and who participates. The Sorry Day on the 13th of February 2008 would have been meaningless if it hadn't been the Prime Minister. The very point of it was that he was speaking for the entire country. I think it's a little different when a private expression of grief is taken over for political purposes.
Another quick poll. How many people here tonight were deeply affected by Sorry Day? Well, once again, but that's not a surprising result in this case, is it?
On the ceremonies about the returned dead from Afghanistan, it certainly has a powerful political ambition, that whole thing. It isn't just getting the politicians some spotlight, though it is partly that. It's also an attempt to paper over the fact that the war is incredibly controversial, and that although these individual soldiers who were killed, it's very sad that that's happened, there are thousands of people killed in Afghanistan whom we're not just not commemorating, we're by and large ignoring.
And we will never know how many died in Iraq.
A million is the latest figure. A million people died. A million civilians have died in Iraq.
Now, if you think those two wars, as I do, are unjustified wars, morally unjustified wars, not just tactically unfortunate, then these sorts of celebrations, admitting everything about the sadness of these young men, have a political message which I find repellent. I mean, I think it's the message that we are not going to think about these important matters of death.
I want to change the direction. Two things happened to me on the way here. One was the crocodile coming out of the Yarra. The other was two people who came up to me at Mascot when we were going through the airport security system, and they wanted to talk to me about suicide. It was the anniversary of their son's suicide. He committed suicide on his birthday, 29, and today was the anniversary of a death day as well as a birthday. And we stood there for a while just talking about that form, that ethical conundrum that society, I think, handles so badly. Can we look at that? I'd like to know your attitudes philosophically to the right for someone to commit suicide and to social, political attitudes to it. Amanda?
Are you talking about euthanasia or
No,
suicide?
I'm talking about this. Apparently this young man, there was no hint. He bought a new pair of shoes shortly before he killed himself. He had a job he loved. No one had the slightest idea. But suddenly, for whatever reason, he can commit suicide. Now, I've had elderly friends who have chosen to euthanize themselves one way or another, and I've had friends who decided their careers were over. You know, they didn't have a major medical problem, but that was enough. You know, they'd done their dash. What's your attitude to suicide as a choice?
Well, my attitude is superfluous once the deed is done. I mean, it's ridiculous to make it a crime, is all I could say. It's a tragedy in a young person. It's usually got rational reasons in an older person. You look for the failures of support systems maybe when a young person suicides, and you might try and work to correct these.
The suicide of a young person is a catastrophic event for their family and friends. There is no doubt about that. But I think suicide generally, at whatever age, is something which I can respect and understand a person's choice to do that. You know, we value autonomy very highly in our society, and suicide is the ultimate expression of an autonomous choice. You know, someone once said, suicide is a man's way of saying to God, you can't fire me, I quit.
Tony?
Yes, I think an awful lot of suicide is very sad, and particularly younger people, as you say. And I think that quite often people who suicide are really in a bad way mentally and psychologically. They've got not the rational route to this decision. So one would have to be very careful about the cases, I think. But I do think that there can be cases in which suicide is a morally reasonable thing to do. And I think that the obvious cases are those cases where people are in dreadful, unpalliable pain, and they want to die.
Let's segue now into assisted suicide. Let's segue now into an area where the law has very strong attitudes, and it's currently, of course, once again in this country, an urgent topic.
Yeah.
As a lawyer and as a human being, assisted suicide, voluntary euthanasia, whatever you want to call it.
Well, I'll try to be a human being first. I would say that suicide is always a morally justifiable decision, however irrational it may seem to others. To the individual involved, I would never, ever criticise their moral choice to decide that their life is going to end. It follows inevitably that I think that assisted suicide ought to be legal. And frankly, you know, I was involved in a case about 2003, I think, where the public advocate was arguing for the right to withdraw a feeding tube that was inserted through the abdominal wall into a woman's stomach. She'd been in a permanent vegetative state for 10 or 15 years. There was no possibility that she would ever have anything like a life, except she was organically alive. And the argument was, our argument was, that it was lawful to withdraw that feeding tube. Dennis Hart, incidentally, intervened and opposed the making of that order. We won the case, and so the feeding tube was withdrawn, which meant that she died essentially of dehydration over the course of the next week and a half. I think that's a dreadful way to have to assist suicide. I mean, you wouldn't let a dog die that way. If you decided a dog's life was over, you'd put them down cleanly and kindly. And I think we should be allowed to do it to human beings who
Amanda,
want it.
do you agree?
Absolutely. I think euthanasia is one of the major battlegrounds of the secular state, like birth control, like abortion. It is about the autonomous individual's rights over their own body, full stop.
Another poll. Those in favour of voluntary euthanasia here. Well, that's the biggest majority we've had tonight. Isn't it extraordinary, though, again and again in this society, and I suspect in many others, I think this also applies to drug laws, you get the public are light years ahead of the political curve. Why is that?
Marginal electorates, Philip, you know why that is. It's all about, and because the Greens have their primary representation in the Senate, not in marginal electorates, they can afford to push this debate. I mean, the major parties can't afford to run the gauntlet of a few thousand votes, Christian votes, in a marginal electorate. They just can't afford to do it.
And yet they can afford to be horrendously insensitive on the issue of refugees.
Yes.
For the same reason.
Yes.
That people with strong religious views seem to be prepared to push out boat people and treat them miserably.
On the...
Stick up for God, Tony.
Yes, I was about to stick up for God. On the Christian vote thing, I mean, I'm a Christian who thinks that voluntary euthanasia in certain circumstances is morally okay. I think that we need to distinguish between the inherent judgment on assisted suicide, voluntary euthanasia, about its intrinsic morality, which I think is in certain circumstances, not others, okay. But then there is another question about how to implement it legally and in practice. And I think some of the people who oppose it don't oppose it on the grounds that they think it's intrinsically wrong, but on the grounds that they worry about how it can be legally implemented. Now, some people phonily worry about how it can be legally implemented because their real objection is an intrinsic objection, and I don't like that sort of deviousness. But there are real questions about how it should be implemented. I mean, the interesting thing is that we've now got at least 3 jurisdictions overseas, in Holland, in Belgium, and in Oregon, which can be sort of case studies for how it's working. And there's controversy about how it works. My impression is that it seems to work pretty well. But I think the people who worry about, you know, will the relatives put pressure on, and so on, have got real worries that need to be addressed in their own terms.
You need to make sure that the opponents don't derail the debate. If the debate is about voluntary euthanasia and they're talking about involuntary euthanasia, we're not meeting on the same track.
No, I didn't mean that. I mean legislation for voluntary euthanasia.
Exactly so.
Yes.
And their concern, when you unpick it, is, well, it may not be voluntary.
Yes. And often people make out that elderly people like myself are unable to make rational decisions.
That's what my family tell me all the time.
Well, I think it's probably true in your case, but in my case, it's not. And I know several other cases where it's not. And of course, you have to be careful about how these things, but it's not beyond our wit, I think, to try and work that out.